Welcome to the Accountancy Learning AAT Sample Paper Debriefs. I'm Sarah, and in this video I'll take you through the Principles of Costing Sample Paper 2, Task 4. So this task is about calculating overhead absorption rates and looking at the behaviour of costs. Part A asks us to identify whether the following statements relate to fixed or variable costs. So the first one is unit cost remains the same with changes in activity levels. So we're looking here at the unit cost. So what about the unit cost remains the same with changes in activity levels? So with our fixed cost, if we were to have a fixed cost of £1,000, if we made 10 units, it would be £100 per unit. But if we made 100 units, it would be £10 per unit. So the per unit will change if it's a fixed cost. So because it's going to remain the same, this makes it a variable cost. So the per unit cost, so materials for example, might be £5 per unit, and that stays the same. The second one is unit cost varies with changes in activity levels. So we've just proven that up the top here with our fixed cost. So as we demonstrated, if we've got fixed costs of 1,000, it'd be £100 per unit if 10 are made, or £10 per unit if 100 are made. So therefore it will be a fixed cost that varies with the changes in activity levels. Barrymore Limited produces a single product of which the following budgets have been identified, and we're given here a number of different bits of information. The business is looking to identify how the different budgeted overhead absorption rates affect unit cost. If they used machinery instead of labour, the budgeted machine hours are 2,000. Part B asks us to complete the table below to show what the budgeted overhead cost per unit would be at the three different budgeted overhead absorption rates. And we need to enter all values to 2 decimal places. So let's look at the first one then. So per unit, so this is going to be our 2,500 units, which we've got in here. So our budgeted overhead absorption rate is going to be taking our overheads. So we're going to have 95,000 and we're going to divide it by our number of units, 2,500, to give us 38. So that is going to be our budgeted overhead absorption rate per unit. So that's on a per unit basis. The second column here is budgeted overhead cost per unit. Now, because we've already divided the overheads by our number of units, that means our answer is going to be the same. It's going to be £38. So each unit will have £38 of overhead cost. On to the next one then is we've now got 3,000 labour hours that we are going to use as our overhead absorption basis. So per unit is now going to ask us to work out the hours per unit. So we have 3,000 hours, and we're going to divide that by 2,500 units to give us a per unit figure, which gives us 1.2. And remember, we're answering to 2 decimal places all the time. Our budgeted overhead absorption rate will then be the 95,000 divided by the total labour hours of 3,000, which gives us 31.5 0.67 to 2 decimal places. Now, the budgeted overhead cost per unit is not going to be the same as the overhead absorption rate like it was in our per unit basis, because there's 1.2 hours of labour per unit. So what we first of all need to do is multiply the overhead absorption rate that we've just calculated by 1.2 to give us the overhead cost per unit, which still turns out to be £38. And then next we have the machine hours of 2,000. So it will be 95,000. Divide that by 2,000 to get £47.50 as our overhead absorption rate. And we also need to do our hours per unit. So this time we've got 2,000 hours over the same number of units, our 2,500 units, which gives us 0.8 hours per unit. And once again, just like we did with labour hours, we now need to work out the cost per unit, but we first have to multiply our overhead absorption rate by our hours per unit. So multiply it by 0.8, and as it happens we get £38 overhead cost per unit again. And that's the end of task 4.